Chapter 27, An Audience with the Queen. What on earth are you doing here? Asked Ben. What on earth are you doing here, Your Majesty? I like to come here when I can't sleep, replied the Queen. She spoke in that instantly familiar, posh voice of hers. Ben and Granny were surprised to see she was wearing a nightgown and little furry corgi slippers. She was also wearing the coronation crown on her head. It was the most magnificent of all the crown jewels. The Archbishop of Canterbury placed it on her head when she was crowned queen in 1953. The crown, which dates back to 1661, is made of gold, encrusted with diamonds, rubies, pearls, emeralds, and sapphires. It was an impressive look, even for the Queen. I come here to think, the Queen went on. I got my chauffeur to bring me over from Buckingham Palace in the Bentley. I have my Christmas address to the nation in a few weeks, and I need to think carefully about what I want to say. One always finds it easier to think with one's crown on. The question is, what on earth are you two doing here? And here's a picture of the Queen in her nightgown with her corgi slippers and her crown. And here's the picture from the next page that I'm about to read. Ben and Granny looked at each other, ashamed. Being told off was bad enough at the best of times, but being told off by the Queen was on a whole other level of being told offness, as this simple graph demonstrates. And so now this graph is going to make a little bit more sense. And it's funny when you look at the graph, at the bottom it's a parent and then a teacher, then you have the head teacher, which would be our principal, and then you have a judge and then the Queen. So I'm going to give you some time to look at this order, because that order is actually quite interesting. I find it amazing that parents are at the very bottom. And why do the pair of you smell like poo-poo? Well, pushed Her Majesty. I'm waiting. I'm solely the blame, Your Majesty, said Granny, bowing her head. No, she's not, said Ben. It was me who said we should steal the crown jewels. I talked her into it. That's true, said Granny, but it's not what I meant. I started this whole thing when I pretended to be an international jewel thief. What? Exclaimed Ben. Pardon, said the Queen. One is terribly confused. My grandson hated staying with me on Friday night, said Granny. I heard him one night calling his parents and complaining about how boring I was. But Granny, I don't think that anymore, protested Ben. It's all right, Ben. I know things have changed since then. And in truth, I was boring. I just like to eat cabbage and play Scrabble, and I knew deep down that you hated those things. So I made up stories from the books I've read to entertain you. I told you I was an infamous jewel thief called the Black Cat. But what about those diamonds you showed me, said Ben, feeling shocked and angry that he'd been deceived. All worthless, dear, replied Granny. Made of glass. I found them in an old ice cream tub at the local charity shop. Ben stared at her. He couldn't believe it. The whole thing, the whole incredible story was made up. I can't believe you lied to me, he said. I mean, said Granny, faltering. Ben turned to glare at her. You're not my gangster, Granny, after all, he said. Then there was a deafening silence in Jewel House, followed by a rather loud and rather posh cough. Said an imperious voice. Chapter 28, Hung, Drawn, and Quartered. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, said the Queen in her clipped tone, but might we get back to the important matter at hand? I still don't understand why you two are here in the Tower of London in the middle of the night, smelling of poo-poo and attempting to steal my jewels. Well, once I had started, the lie grew and grew, Your Majesty, continued Granny, avoiding Ben's eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen. I just got carried away, I suppose. It was so nice to spend extra time with my grandson, to have him with me. It reminded me of when I used to read him bedtime stories. That was in the days when he didn't mind. That was in the days he didn't find me boring. Ben fidgeted. He was starting to feel guilty too. Granny had lied to him, and that was horrible. But she'd only done it because she was upset that he thought she was dull. I had fun too, he whispered. Granny smiled at him. I'm glad, little Benny. I'm so sorry, I really, interrupted the queen. Oh, yes, said Granny. Well, before I knew it, things had snowballed, and we were planning to take on the most daring robbery of all times. We climbed up the sewage pipe, by the way. We usually don't smell like this, Your Majesty. I should hope not. Pew-wee! Ben was feeling really guilty now. Even if Granny had never been an international jewel thief, she certainly wasn't boring. She had helped plan the robbery with him, and now here they were in the Tower of London at midnight talking to the Queen. I have to do something to help her, Ben realized. The robbery was my idea, Your Majesty, he said. I'm so sorry. Please let my grandson go, interjected Granny. I don't want his young life ruined. Please, I beg you. We were going to return the crown jewels tomorrow night, I promise. A likely story, murmured the Queen. It's true, exclaimed Ben. Please do what you want with me, Your Majesty, continued Granny. Have me locked up in the tower forever, if you like. But I beg you, let the boy go. The Queen looked lost in thought. I really don't know what to do, said the Queen eventually. I am touched by your story. As you know, I am too a grandmother, and my grandchildren find me dull sometimes. Really? Asked Ben. But you are the Queen. I know, the Queen chuckled. Ben was stunned. He had never seen the Queen laugh before. She was usually so serious and never cracked a smile when giving her speech on TV at Christmas, or opening Parliament, or even watching comedians at the Royal Variety Show. But to them, I'm just their boring old granny, she continued. They forgot that I was young once, and that they too will be old one day, added Granny, with a meaningful look to Ben. Exactly, my dear, agreed the Queen. I think the younger generation need to have a bit more time for the elderly. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, said Ben. If I hadn't been so selfish and moaned about old people being boring, none of this would have happened. There was an uncomfortable silence. Granny rummaged in her handbag and offered the Queen a bag of sweets. Murray mint, Your Majesty? Yes, please, said the Queen. She unwrapped it and popped it into her mouth. Gosh, I haven't had one of these for years. They're my favorite, said Granny. And they last so long, added the Queen as she sucked it before composing herself again. Do you know what happened to the last man who attempted to steal the crown jewels? Inquired the Queen. Was he hung, drawn, and quartered? Asked Ben excitedly. Believe it or not, he was pardoned, said the Queen with a wry smile. Pardon, Your Majesty, said Granny. In 1671, an Irishman by the name of Colonel Blood tried to steal them, but was caught by guards as he tried to escape. He hid this very crown I am wearing now under his cloak and dropped it on the ground just outside. King Charles II was so amused by Colonel Blood's daring attempt that he set him free. I must Google him, said Ben. I don't know what Googling is, said Granny. Nor me, chuckled the Queen. So in royal tradition, that's what I'm going to do. Pardon you both. Oh, thank you, Your Majesty, said Granny, kissing her hand. Ben fell to his knees. Thank you so much, Your Majesty. Yes, don't grovel, said the Queen haughtily. I cannot abide by groveling. I have met far too many grovelers during my reign. I'm so sorry, Your Majestical Royal Majesty, said Granny. That's exactly what I mean. You're groveling now, replied the Queen. Ben and Granny looked at each other in fear. It was hard not to speak to Her Majesty without groveling at least a little bit. Now jolly along quickly, please, said the Queen, before this whole place is overrun with guards. And don't forget to watch me on the telly on Christmas Day.